Chapter 20, The Last Frontier. The Last Frontier. In 1862, the artist Emmanuel Letouze completed a 20 by 30 foot mural in the U.S. Capitol building. Lutz's work, see pages 460 to 461, shows a pioneer wagon train winding its way up a steep mountain slope. A guide on the rocky trail waves his hand toward the promised land ahead, beckoning his followers into the forests and valleys of the frontier west. Bathed in the golden light of sunset, women cradle their babies, bearded farmers ride on horseback, and tanned riflemen stare into the nation's future. At the mountain's highest point, in front of snow-capped peaks that reach toward the sky, a man removes his cap and hoists an American flag. A blue scroll weaves across the upper border of Lutz's mural, its gold letter proclaiming, "Westward, the course of empire takes its way." In the half-century following the Civil War, Americans expanded their empire across the continent. But Americans' westward expansion is not, as Lutz's mural suggests, simply the story of individual pioneers setting out for a vast wilderness. Instead, it is also a tale of railroad, timber, and mining companies seeking to exploit the natural resources of the West. It is a tale of Native Americans, white migrants, and immigrants clashing over land. It includes, as a leading character, a strong federal government shaping the rate and course of expansion. It is, above all, the story of an ever-shifting frontier that was fast disappearing by the late 19th century. Settling the West. In the first decade of the 1800s, during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark explored the lands of the Louisiana Purchase. In the following decades, fur trappers made their way to the Pacific Northwest. In 1848, at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, a defeated Mexico ceded present-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, as well as parts of Colorado, Nevada, and Utah to the United States, thus extending the nation's territorial holdings from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In 1849, when news spread of the discovery of gold in California, more than 250,000 fortune seekers from all parts of the globe quickly descended on the territory already inhabited by many Mexican ranchers and Native Americans. By the 1850s, as Americans proclaimed their manifest destiny to overspread the continent, thousands of pioneers were traveling the Oregon and Santa Fe trails in covered wagons, hoping to find cheap, fertile land beyond the frontier. By 1860, the Mormon state of Deseret had grown into a prosperous and self-sufficient colony of 40,000 residents, and still more settlers continued to push into the region beyond the Mississippi after the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad. In the spring of 1869, a boisterous crowd gathered at Promontory Point, Utah, a desolate little town of shacks, sagebrush, and shrubby cedars. They were there to celebrate what the New York Times called the completion of the greatest enterprise ever yet taken. The completion of a railroad spanning the United States, a transcontinental railroad. As recently as the 1830s, when railroads were still new in the United States, few visionaries dreamed of running trains from San Francisco to New York. Most people thought that they were crazy. Laid on tracks across thousands of miles of empty prairie, over mountain ranges, through unknown and often hostile territory, one member of Congress said they might as well try to build a railroad to the moon. But as trains proved to be a quick, cheap, easy way of moving goods and people, a web of railroad lines spread across the industrial East, reaching as far as the Missouri River. In 1849, when the California gold rush drew hordes of frenzied treasure seekers to the West Coast, the notion of building a transcontinental railroad no longer seemed so crazy. But what route would it take? Northern politicians wanted the railroad to run through northern states. Southern politicians wanted to take a southern route. During the Civil War, when representatives and senators from southern states resigned from Congress, no one was left to oppose a northern route. On July 1st, 1862, President Lincoln signed into law the Pacific Railway Act, an act to aid in the construction of a railroad and telegraph line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean, and to secure the government the use of the same for postal, military, and other purposes. The Railway Pacific Act said that two companies would build at the same time. The Union Pacific Company would start where the current railroads stopped the Missouri River, and from there work west. The Central Pacific Company would start in California and work east. For labor, the Central Pacific Company turned to many Chinese immigrants who had recently arrived in California. At first, Irish railroad bosses doubted these small, slender men who could do the job. But the Chinese proved to be steady workers who did just as much as, or more than, any other crew. The Pacific Railway Act gave the Central Pacific the right to build only as far as the California-Nevada border, but the company protested. If they conquered the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountain range before their competitors reached California, why should they stop there? Why not keep on laying tracks and winning huge amounts of land and money from the government until the two railroads met? Congress amended the Pacific Railway Act to allow each company to build as far and as fast as it could. The race was on. One leader of the Union Pacific team, a former Civil War general named Jack Casement, ran his operation like an army. Fortunately, many of his men, including immigrants from Ireland, Sweden, and Germany, as well as former slaves, had also fought in the war, so they were used to taking orders. Sadly, they also needed their military skills for skirmishes against the Sioux and Cheyenne Indians, whose hunting grounds were being destroyed by the advance of the railroad. As the two competing railroads neared each other, the companies pushed their crews to work harder and faster. Buoyed by pride and the promise of higher wages, the men labored round the clock through blinding snowstorms and deadly avalanches. On May 10, 1869, the railroads met at Promontory Point for the great celebration. Two locomotives faced each other on the track, one facing east, the other facing west. A brass band struck a tune as the last two rails were carried forward. One was carried by a crew of Chinese workmen from the Central Pacific Company, the other by Irish laborers from the Union Pacific. A final spike sat ready to be hammered into the last tie. Not an ordinary iron spike, but one made of California gold. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, raised a silver-headed sledgehammer. As the golden spike slipped into place, a telegraph operator tapped out the one-word message that sped to distant cities and towns. Done! The facing locomotives inched closer and closer until the drivers could reach out and shake hands. The Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, the American people were now linked by the Transcontinental Railroad. In the decades ahead, many more thousands of miles of track were laid across the United States. By the 1890s, 5 transcontinental railroad lines crossed the country. The growing track of railroads linked once distant parts of the country and spurred the growth of a national economy as goods moved promptly and cheaply from one region to another. The Pony Express. In 1860, when no railroads stretched across the western part of the United States, people still wanted a quick way to move their mail across the continent. So, a group of Missouri businessmen decided to start their own speedy private mail service using a relay system. They called it the Pony Express. With 400 fast ponies or horses, 80 young riders, and more than 150 stations, the Pony Express could deliver mail between St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California, nearly 2,000 miles apart, in 8 days. The service lasted only about a year and a half because it could not compete with a much speedier innovation. In 1861, Americans finished building a telegraph line across the continent, and the Pony Express went out of business. A diverse mix. At a time when the American population was growing faster than that of any other industrialized nation, the West attracted more new residents than the rest of the country. Farmers and miners, ranchers and loggers, merchants and bankers all crossed the Mississippi after the Civil War to seek their fortunes in the mountains and plains. They formed the largest internal migration of people in American history. Between 1860 and 1890, the population west of the Mississippi quadrupled from 4.5 million to 16.8 million. Wow. Newcomers poured into the grasslands of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota Territory, the hills of Montana, Colorado, and Wyoming, and the arid sands of Nevada and Arizona. As they moved, they raced toward an ever-shrinking frontier. While farmers moved west from the Mississippi River, Mexican ranchers drifted north into Utah and Colorado, Canadians moved south into the Dakotas and Montana, and Chinese immigrants journeyed across the Pacific to California and points inland. A new wave of immigration brought a mix of ethnicities to the West. In any given year between 1875 and 1900, between one-third and one-half of the population of the Northern Plains was foreign-born. Railroad companies and local governments sent agents abroad to lure newcomers with brochures that promised, for example, a flowery meadow of great fertility clothed in nutritious grasses. Immigrants arrived from Russia, Eastern Europe, Germany, and especially Scandinavia, a region in Northern Europe mainly made up of the countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. In the early 1880s, more than 100,000 Scandinavians settled in the northern Great Plains every year. By 1890, 400 towns in Minnesota bore Scandinavian names. As the frontier advanced, cultures collided. Native-born white Americans encountered Latino ranchers in the Southwest, and everywhere whites clashed with Native Americans. While Latino shepherds in New Mexico burned down the barns of the rich white cattlemen who seized their land, Native Americans waged a long struggle to preserve their hunting grounds. After the California gold rush, immigrants from China began to arrive on the Pacific coast by the thousands, and in the 1870s and 1880s by the tens of thousands. By 1880, there were just over 100,000 people of Chinese descent in America. They found work in mines, farms, and most notably, building the Union and Central Pacific Railroads. Many Chinese immigrants held on to their own language and customs. When the Chinese states sank into an economic depression in the 1870s and early 1880s, white Westerners increasingly resented the Chinese competition for jobs. Hardworking and willing to accept low wages, the Chinese were popular with railroad bosses and farm owners, and white laborers blamed them for falling wages and rising unemployment.
Go west, young man!
The New York newspaper editor Horace Greeley is perhaps most often remembered today for the enthusiastic advice he gave in 1865 editorial. Go west, young man, go west! Greeley had himself traveled widely on the Great Plains and had seen the promise of the American West firsthand. Greeley shared the growing sense among his countrymen that, with the Civil War over, the Transcontinental Railroad under construction, and free federal land grants readily available, the time was ripe for settlement. Modern scholars point out that, although the famously phrased advice is usually associated with Greeley, 14 years earlier, an Indiana journalist, John B.L. Sewell, had written, "Go west, young man, and grow up with the country." The new Western economy. While earlier generations of Americans had envisioned the West as a haven for self-sufficient farmers, Western settlers in the late 19th century relied on the market economy to make their living. Railroads spurred the rapid settlement of the West. The growth of the railroads hastened the development of Western mining, agriculture, and industry. The growth of mining. By the 1850s, as the California gold rush drew to a close, prospectors spread out across the West. Western mining followed a pattern of development from isolated prospectors to big businesses. At first, a few lonely wanderers found flecks of gold, silver, or copper in a mountain stream. When word got out, once deserted hillsides crawled with thousands of prospectors. Ramshackle boomtowns sprang up, dotted with tar paper shacks and rickety saloons, and soon the miners were joined by frontier lawyers, merchants, and gamblers. Before long, mining companies bought the surrounding territory, brought in smelters and mills, and constructed company towns. Soon the original prospectors went on their way, hoping to strike it rich on their own. Miners were the most mobile group in American history. In a typical California mining town, of every 100 people present in 1850, only 5 remained after 6 years. They would pan in one spot for a few weeks or months until the gold ran out, or until news arrived of a bigger strike somewhere else. Then it was off by horse, wagon, or steamboat to the next bonanza. In June 1859, 2 prospectors found a vein of blue rock in the Carson River Valley of Nevada. The ore they extracted turned out to be 3 parts gold to 1 part silver. They discovered what turned out to be the richest mine in history, the Comstock Lode, named after Henry Comstock, an early claimant on the site. In the following decades, miners extracted more than 200 million worth of metal from the Nevada mountains. 15,000 people crowded into nearby Virginia City, which grew from a cluster of tents into a thriving boom town with 5 newspapers and a stock exchange. On the other side of the Rockies, rumors spread in the early 1870s that the Black Hills of Dakota had hid rich veins of gold. In an 1868 treaty, the U.S. government had granted the land to the Sioux Indian tribe, and federal troops were posted to stop trespassers. But once an official investigation confirmed the presence of gold in the Black Hills, miners began to sneak past the guards. Government agents tried to buy the land, but the Sioux refused to sell. In October 1875, the frustrated agents opened the district anyway. Most of Dakota's gold was buried beneath the hills under tons of rock. The only way to reach it was a tunnel through the mountainside, which required equipment the average miner could not afford. In the Dakotas and across the West, engineers and entrepreneurs started to replace prospectors and their pans. Large corporations such as the Homestake Mining Company in the Black Hills took over the mining country. In the 1870s, a small group of wealthy financiers, funded by millions of dollars from Eastern British investors, had bought up most of the wines in the West. Mining had become big business. America's growing industries created a demand for non-precious metals like copper and lead. The Anaconda copper mine in Montana provided metal for electrical wire just as the age of electricity dawned. Miners labored in deep tunnels where conditions ranged from unpleasant to dangerous. Temperatures could rise above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the acrid odor of blasting powder mixed with the stench of human waste. Dust hung in the air, and cave-ins were common. Despite the risks, underground mines grew to become the second largest employer in the region after agriculture. As fortune seekers headed west and boomtowns sprang up, the population in some areas increased enough for the regions to apply for statehood. Colorado became a state in 1876. In 1889, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington all joined the Union. And in 1890, Idaho and Wyoming became part of the United States, bringing the total number of states to 44. Acquiring Alaska. Alaska, the vast peninsula extending from the northwestern edge of North America to within 50 miles of Asia, was claimed by Russia during the 18th century. For many years, Russian, British, and American fur traders shared Alaska's abundant natural resources under the governance of a company chartered by Russia's Tsar. By the mid-19th century, when otter were becoming scarce, profits declined for Russian fur traders. Since Russia's resources were strained by a war, the country's leaders offered to sell the Alaskan Territory in 1867. Andrew Johnson's Secretary of State, William Seward, an ardent expansionist, seized the opportunity to acquire this enormous source of timber, furs, and metals. He negotiated the purchase of Alaska for just over $7 million, but not everyone shared his vision. Many Americans thought that this frigid land is a waste of taxpayers' money and referred to it as Seward's Folly, and Seward's Icebox. The criticism ended when gold was discovered in the Yukon in 1896, and thousands of prospectors made their way north. Alaska became the 49th and largest state in 1959. Boy, that's ironic. Cattle ranchers and cowboys. Longhorn cattle had roamed across southern Texas since the 1600s. I'm just going to start over right now because that was a really bad start. Cattle ranchers and cowboys. Longhorn cattle had roamed across southern Texas since the 1600s when Spanish colonists drove them up from Mexico. The animals multiplied in the grasslands between the Rio Grande and the Gulf of Mexico. By the end of the Civil War, some 5 million cattle were grazing on the open, unfenced lands of the Texas Range. The Civil War depleted the livestock herds of the East and the Plains. A steer worth $4 in Texas might fetch $40 in Illinois and $80 in New York. In this environment, a rancher who could get his beef to northern and eastern markets would strike it rich. The Kansas Pacific Railroad was rapidly reaching its way west from Kansas City, some 80 miles north of Texas cattle country. Joseph McCoy, an Illinois meat dealer, saw the potential in connecting Texas cattlemen with eastern customers. After securing cheap shipping rates on the rail lines to Chicago, McCoy prepared Albion, Kansas, a sleepy little town on the new rail line, to become the first of the West's famous cattle towns. Ranchers drove their herds north from Texas on the Chisholm Trail, a flat, grassy route through the Oklahoma land called the Indian Territory. At Abilene, they sold the animals to a stock dealer for a tidy profit. The cattle were loaded on freight cars bound for Chicago, where they were butchered and prepared for Eastern tables. In the summer of 1867, ranchers drove some 35,000 steers up the Chisholm Trail. They were the first of millions of cattle that marched north from Texas in the next 2 decades. On these long drives, ranchers employed cowboys, a third of whom were black, Mexican, or Indian, to guide herds of 2,000 to 3,000 cattle for 10 to 15 miles a day. Cowboys lived a rough life. The work was hard and sometimes dangerous. The cowboy Teddy Blue Abcott recalled, "If a storm come and the cattle started running, you'd hear that low rumbling noise along the ground. Then you'd jump for your horse and get out of there in the lead trying to hit 'em before they scattered the hill and gone. It was riding in a dead run in the dark with cut branches and prairie dog holes all around you, not knowing that the next jump would land you in a shallow grave." That is so fun to say. I love it. Okay. Cattle is a big business. As the railroads pushed farther into the plains, cattle drivers met the railroads in new cattle towns such as Ellsworth and Dodge City, Kansas, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Denver, Colorado. Railroad cars brought western beef to tables and up and down the coast. Much of the meat in Europe also came from the American plains. In the 1870s and 1880s, thousands of would-be ranchers seeking quick profits scraped together enough money to buy a herd. Cattle soon blanketed the public land from Dakota to Arizona, fattening on the free grass and multiplying their owners' profits. Rumors of easy money drew the attention of Eastern and foreign investors. During the 1880s, millions of dollars of capital streamed in from businessmen, bankers, and lawyers in Scotland, England, and New York. The result was a handful of giant ranches that engulfed the Great Plains. These giant businesses encroached on land used by smaller ranchers, shepherds, and farmers. Sheep and cattle competed for grass in New Mexico and the western edges of the plains. Spats between cattlemen and Latino sheepmen often erupted in gunfire. Plains farmers had resented cattlemen since the earliest days of the drive. Cows overran farmers' fields and filled their water. Farmers began to fence off their property. Since there was no wood on the plains for fencing, they used a recent invention called barbed wire. Wire studded with sharp cutting points. Millions of barbed wire fencing divided and closed off land that was once open range. Wealthy cattlemen used the same tactics against their smaller competitors. By the mid-1880s, large stock owners had enclosed huge portions of the range in barbed wire, including public roads, and grasslands. Poor ranchers retaliated by cutting their fences and stealing motherless calves. In Wyoming in 1892, the dispute flared into full-blown warfare when wealthy ranchers hired 50 gunmen to drive small small stockmen out of the region. By then, however, the heyday of the so-called cattle kingdom had passed. The grasslands grew thin from overgrazing. Heavy blizzards in the winter of 1886-1887 killed thousands of cattle on the plains. One Dakota resident remembered countless carcasses of cattle going down with the ice, rolling over and over as they went, sometimes with all four stiffened legs pointing skyward. Even with these losses, the supply of cattle exceeded demand, thus driving down prices. By the 1890s, cattle country, which had once covered more than 40% of the nation's land area, not counting Alaska, began to shrink. The days of the open range and the long drive were over. Cattle now grazed on fenced-in private lands until they were herded into a nearby railroad town. Cowboys who once rode the open plains now planted fence posts on large ranches. I remember when we sat around the fire the winter through and didn't do a lick of work for 5 or 6 months of the year, one cowboy said. I tell you, times have changed. Wire draw is so fun to do.